The Second World War had brought the world to the brink of collapse. In the occupied territories of Europe, survival was not just a struggle. It was a slow, relentless battle against hunger, fear, and the all-encompassing shadow of tyranny. The year was 1943, and the war had dragged on for nearly 4 years, showing no signs of mercy. For those living under Nazi occupation, each day felt like an eternity. Cities had been bombed, homes reduced to rubble, and the streets were littered with the remnants of lives once full of promise. It was a time when history felt like it was being rewritten in blood, and no one knew whether the ink had run out for good. In the small, crumbling town of St. Clair, nestled in the hills of central France, the war had already written its harsh chapter. It had become a place of quiet despair, where the once vibrant streets had now become empty and silent, save for the occasional German patrol. The people here had known hardship before, but nothing had prepared them for the merciless grip of occupation. The village was cut off from the rest of the world. The railway lines that had once brought goods from far-off cities were now empty, the trains no longer carrying food, supplies, or even news. The sound of wheels on tracks had been replaced by the drumming of boots on cobblestone streets. The villagers had once been proud, hard-working folk, with fields that had yielded enough to feed them and their families. But now, those same fields were barren, not because of drought or poor soil, but because the Germans had seized everything. The farmers' animals had been taken for the military's needs, and the crops they had worked so hard to grow were now being shipped off to feed the war machine that was sweeping through Europe. The local shopkeeper, once the heart of the community, now stood behind a counter stocked with empty shelves. The small amounts of food that still remained were rationed, not by the village's own rules, but by the strict directives of the occupying forces. Even the simplest of items, bread, butter, eggs, were luxuries, often beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. A loaf of bread might be all that stood between a family and starvation, but for the vast majority, even that was a rarity. The elderly, the sick, and the children suffered the most. Their bodies were weakened by months, even years, of undernourishment. What was once a vibrant town now felt like a ghost town, with hollow eyes peering out from behind closed doors, too afraid to speak, too afraid to look their occupiers in the eye. In these dark days, the people of St. Clair did not simply suffer in silence. They had learned to survive in ways that were unimaginable to those outside the occupation. They had become experts in bartering, in hiding, and in sharing what little they had. It was a survival instinct that had been honed by necessity, but even this was beginning to fail. In the early days of the occupation, the villagers had tried to resist in small ways, by hiding food, by offering small acts of defiance, and by maintaining a semblance of normal life despite the oppression. But as the months turned into years, that resistance began to fade, replaced by a quiet surrender to the brutal reality of their situation. Hope had become a rare commodity, one that was no longer traded on the open market. People no longer believed that the Allies would come to their aid. The promises of liberation seemed like distant dreams, and the soldiers of the Wehrmacht had become a constant, unshakable presence in their lives. The villagers had learned to stay quiet, to keep their heads down, and to make do with whatever scraps they could scavenge. And then, in the midst of this grim existence, something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A few strangers began to appear in the village, people who didn't belong there. They didn't wear the uniforms of the German occupiers, nor did they resemble the local French civilians. These were soldiers, but not of the Wehrmacht. These were British soldiers, members of a resistance movement operating behind enemy lines. Their arrival was an anomaly, a flicker of hope in a world that had been plunged into darkness. At first, no one knew what to make of them. The villagers, though desperate, were naturally suspicious. Had these soldiers come to bring them into the larger war? Were they here to help, or were they just another group of outsiders who would pass through, taking what little they had left? Fear and doubt were bred into them over the years of occupation, and they had learned to trust no one. But as the British soldiers passed through the villagers could not help but notice one thing. There was something different about these men. They did not carry the same cold, domineering presence as the German troops. They did not bark orders or demand respect. They walked the streets quietly, nodding politely to the villagers, making brief exchanges with the shopkeeper, and most surprisingly, they carried with them food. Rations, yes, but to the villagers, it was an unfamiliar luxury. It was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless landscape. Some villagers saw them as a potential salvation, but others felt uneasy. Could this kindness be real? Was it a trap? And yet, for those few moments when the British soldiers offered food to the villagers, there was an unmistakable sense of connection, an unspoken understanding that they were, in some way, all in this together. They were all caught in the same web of war, struggling to survive in a world that had forgotten what compassion looked like. One of these soldiers, a young man named Sergeant Thomas, had seen firsthand the effects of the war on civilians. He had been a part of several covert operations across Europe, providing aid to the resistance, gathering intelligence, and, in some cases, offering food to starving villagers. He understood the value of such simple acts of generosity, especially in a world where cruelty had become so pervasive. As he walked through St. Clair, he saw the faces of the villagers, haggard, worn, and empty. They had suffered far too long, and Sergeant Thomas knew that their suffering was far from over. But for a brief moment, he could offer them something that might make their lives just a little bit easier. He had a small supply of rations in his pack. Nothing much, just enough to feed a few people. But it was something. When he reached the market square, a group of villagers stood watching him from a distance. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of curiosity, hunger, and wariness. Sergeant Thomas felt their gaze, but he did not falter. He reached into his pack and pulled out a few cans of rations, some packets of dried meat, and a small loaf of bread. His hands shook slightly as he extended the food towards them. The villagers looked at the offerings, and for a moment, there was silence. Their hands, once eager and desperate, hesitated. The years of starvation and deprivation had taught them not to trust easily, not to accept anything without wondering if it might cost them dearly. It was a moment suspended in time, a split second when the weight of history hung heavy on the air. But then, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the villagers began to reach out, their hands trembling as they took the food. There was no immediate thank you, no words exchanged. It wasn't necessary. The act of receiving was enough. In that brief moment, something inside the villagers shifted. They had expected rejection, another instance where their hunger would be ignored, another reminder that the world had turned its back on them. But instead, they were given sustenance, and with it, a glimmer of hope. A simple act of kindness, unexpected and unspoken, had broken through the walls of fear and mistrust that had built up over the years. It was not a grand gesture, but in the context of their war-torn lives, it was everything. It was a lifeline. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there could still be humanity. For Sergeant Thomas, the act was not just about giving food, it was about giving something more. It was about restoring a sense of dignity to people who had been stripped of it. It was a reminder that, even in a world consumed by violence and hatred, there could still be moments of grace. And for the villagers of St. Clair, that moment would remain etched in their memories forever. It was a moment of unexpected generosity, a moment that would change the course of their lives, and the course of the war, in ways they could not yet comprehend. In the aftermath of that quiet exchange, the village of St. Clair remained cloaked in the same heavy silence that had characterized its existence under Nazi occupation. For the villagers, however, the days that followed carried a subtle, yet undeniable shift in the air. Their world, which had been dominated by hunger, fear, and the ever-present threat of violence, suddenly felt a little less suffocating. The simple act of receiving food from the British soldiers had stirred something within them, an emotion they had long ago buried beneath the weight of survival. It was an unfamiliar sensation, like a candle flickering in the dark, but it was enough to offer a brief respite from the brutality that defined their lives. For the British soldiers, however, this act of generosity was more than just a fleeting moment of kindness. It was a calculated decision, part of a broader strategy designed not only to provide aid to the suffering civilians but also to gather information, to test the waters of resistance, and perhaps, to ignite a spark of defiance in the hearts of those who had long been subdued by the war. These soldiers were not here on some grand mission of liberation, not yet. They were part of a covert operation, behind enemy lines, operating in secrecy, and most importantly, operating with caution. The lives of their comrades and the success of their mission depended on their ability to navigate the delicate balance between trust and suspicion. Sergeant Thomas, who had offered the food to the villagers, knew the risks all too well. He had witnessed firsthand the consequences of misplaced trust. In occupied territories, even the smallest act of kindness could be misinterpreted as an invitation to betrayal. He had been trained to operate under the radar, to engage with civilians without drawing attention to his presence, and to assess whether a village or town was receptive to the idea of resistance. He understood that the villagers of St. Clair, though starved and beaten down, had learned to survive in ways that bordered on instinctual. Their skepticism ran deep. After years of occupation, they had learned to expect little, to trust no one, and to rely on nothing but their own wits to get by. To the German soldiers, the villagers were just a means to an end, people to be exploited, subdued, and controlled. But to the British resistance, they were potential allies. Allies who could help turn the tide of the war, if only they could be brought to trust the right people at the right time. Sergeant Thomas had seen it in the eyes of the villagers. The wariness, the hesitation, the reluctance to accept anything that might come from a foreign hand. They had been beaten down by years of occupation, their spirits crushed under the weight of hopelessness. But beneath that hard exterior, Thomas could also see something else, a glimmer of humanity that refused to be extinguished. It was that flicker of hope that had compelled him to offer the food in the first place. He had not done it for his own glory, nor for the satisfaction of his superiors. He had done it because he believed that even in the darkest corners of the war, small acts of kindness could be a catalyst for something far greater. He was not blind to the risks, but in the world of espionage and resistance, risk was a constant companion. As the days passed, Thomas and his comrades began to notice a subtle change in the behavior of the villagers. Where once there had been only fear and caution, there was now something else, a tentative curiosity. The villagers had not immediately embraced the soldiers. No, the trust that had been earned was fragile, built on a single meal shared under a cloud of uncertainty. But there was a shift. It was not visible in grand gestures or open declarations of loyalty, but it was there, woven into the fabric of their interactions. A few villagers began to approach the soldiers, not with suspicion, but with quiet questions. Some offered scraps of information, small details about the movements of the German forces, the locations of patrols, or the supply routes that ran through the village. These were not the kind of details that would bring the Germans to their knees, but they were important. They were the building blocks of something larger. The soldiers, in turn, responded with subtle encouragement. They never pushed the villagers too far. They knew that to do so would be to risk exposing their presence and jeopardizing the fragile trust they had begun to establish. Instead, they offered what little they had: information, rations, the occasional word of comfort in a language none of them fully understood. They made it clear, without saying it outright, that they were there to help. The message was not delivered through grand speeches or propaganda, but through the simplest of gestures. A shared look, a silent nod, a cup of water passed from one hand to another. It was the language of survival, of mutual need and unspoken understanding. Despite these quiet exchanges, the villagers remained hesitant. They had learned, over the years, to keep their heads down, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The Germans were quick to punish those who were suspected of collaborating with the enemy, and the price of such collaboration was steep. The village had already seen what happened to those who resisted, to those who were caught trying to outwit their occupiers. The fear of retribution ran deep. It was one thing to accept a meal from a foreign soldier. It was another thing entirely to risk everything by becoming involved in something far greater. And yet there were whispers. Whispers that spoke of the possibility of liberation, of the day when the Allies would return to drive the Germans from their land. It was a distant hope, a hope that had been dashed too many times before, but it still lingered in the air. Perhaps it was these whispers, more than anything, that kept the villagers from turning their backs on the soldiers entirely. They did not know whether to trust them, but they could not entirely dismiss the possibility that this time, the hope was real. As the tension in the village slowly began to shift, the soldiers also found themselves grappling with the complexity of their mission. They had come to St. Clair not just to offer food, but to test the waters of resistance. They had been instructed to gather information, to understand the lay of the land, and to assess whether the villagers were willing to join the larger cause. But the soldiers were also keenly aware of the fine line they were walking. Too much pressure, too soon, and the villagers would retreat into their shells, closing off any chance of collaboration. The soldiers understood that they needed to earn the villagers' trust, but they also needed to remain anonymous, to avoid drawing the attention of the German forces. They could not afford to be discovered, not yet, not while the war was still in such a precarious state. One evening, as dusk settled over the village and the last remnants of sunlight faded from the sky, a small group of villagers gathered in the back of the local tavern. It was a place where they could meet in relative safety, away from the prying eyes of the German soldiers who patrolled the streets. The group had begun to form quietly in the days following the exchange with Sergeant Thomas. They were not yet a resistance movement. There was no plan, no grand strategy. But there was a shared understanding that things could not continue as they had been. They were weary of simply surviving. They wanted to fight back. They had seen what the Germans were capable of, and they had seen how the British soldiers had treated them, not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was enough to spark something deeper, something more powerful. In that quiet room, the villagers exchanged stories of their suffering, of their losses, of their dreams for a future beyond the war. They spoke of the brutality of the German occupiers, of the acts of kindness they had witnessed from the British soldiers, and of the faintest glimmer of resistance that had begun to grow in their hearts. They did not yet know what form their resistance would take. It was still too dangerous, still too uncertain. But they knew they could no longer remain passive. They were hungry for change, for something more than survival. And though it seemed like a distant dream, they began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the time for that change was finally at hand. For Sergeant Thomas and his comrades, the weeks that followed brought the slow realization that their mission was working. They had not forced the villagers into action, but they had planted the seed of defiance, watered it with kindness, and watched as it began to grow. They knew the risks and they understood the stakes. But they also knew that the smallest spark of resistance, if nurtured properly, could ignite a fire that would spread far beyond the village of St. Clair. It was not just about food, about rations and supplies. It was about restoring hope, about reminding the villagers that they were not alone in their suffering, and that the fight for freedom was not just a distant, abstract concept. It was something they could reach out and touch, something they could be a part of. As the days turned into weeks, the villagers continued to meet in secret, sharing their stories and their hopes. They did not yet know how they would resist, or even if they could, but the simple act of meeting, of talking, of dreaming together, was enough to keep the flicker of hope alive. And for Sergeant Thomas, that was the most important victory of all. He had come to St. Clair to offer food, but he had given them something much more powerful, a reason to believe that they could change their fate. The small acts of kindness that had slowly begun to stitch a fragile thread of trust between the British soldiers and the villagers of St. Clair were now, unspoken, taking root. In the days following Sergeant Thomas's simple gesture of giving food, an air of quiet transformation began to unfold in the village. The war had already ravaged their bodies and spirits, yet for the first time in years, the villagers experienced something they hadn't dared to feel in a long time, a glimmer of possibility. The exchange of food had not just been a transaction. It had been a subtle, silent invitation to something much larger, a door left slightly ajar in a world that had been closed shut. At first, the villagers had been hesitant. Suspicion was a hard thing to shake after years of being under the thumb of an occupying force. Trust was a luxury none of them had afforded themselves in a long time. Every stranger had once been seen as a potential enemy, and every kindness as a potential trap. The Germans had taught them to fear the consequences of any kind of deviation from the status quo. And yet, what they had seen in Sergeant Thomas was something different. His unassuming nature, the quiet way in which he had extended his hand to them, spoke volumes. He had not come as a conqueror. He had come as a fellow human being who understood their suffering. Perhaps that was the key. It wasn't the size of the gesture. It was the understanding behind it, the recognition that they were still human, still worth something in a world that had long abandoned them. The villagers began to talk amongst themselves, cautiously at first, in whispers that barely rose above the hum of everyday life. Some still wondered if they had been foolish, if their hunger had led them to believe in something that wasn't truly there. But others, perhaps those who had suffered the most, those who had watched loved ones perish from malnutrition or sickness, began to believe in what had happened. They began to see the British soldiers not as outsiders or invaders, but as a glimmer of hope in the darkness, as people who had come to help, not harm. They had shown a level of respect and dignity that was in stark contrast to the brutality of the Germans, whose soldiers had long treated them as little more than expendable pawns. Perhaps it was the simple act of receiving food that had broken something open inside them, something long buried by years of fear and mistrust. It was, after all, the most basic of human needs: a meal shared, a moment of connection, a brief respite from the overwhelming tide of war. As the days passed, this fragile bond began to grow. More villagers approached the soldiers, cautiously at first, seeking a moment of interaction, perhaps even an opportunity to ask questions they had long suppressed. The soldiers, for their part, remained carefully neutral, offering nothing more than basic pleasantries and occasional information. They understood the stakes all too well. They had not come to liberate, not yet. They had come to assess, to gauge whether the villagers were open to the idea of resistance. They were in St. Clair not to force the villagers into a fight, but to see if they could begin to light the spark that might eventually spread. And the villagers, slowly but surely, began to offer their trust, little by little. In hushed tones, they spoke about the German patrols, the movements of enemy forces, the roads they traveled, the shifts in the garrison that occupied their town. These were not acts of outright rebellion, nor were they calls to arms, but they were pieces of information, the kind of details that could be used by the resistance. It was not an overt revolution that was taking shape. No, it was subtler than that. It was the quiet formation of a network, built on the smallest of interactions and the most modest of exchanges. The soldiers didn't ask for the information, it was offered willingly. It was not a matter of loyalty to the British or to some distant ideal of freedom. It was simply the need to survive, the desire for dignity in a world that had stripped them of it. The villagers, by offering what they knew, felt that they were taking back some small portion of their agency, that they were doing something, anything, that might have an impact. What's more, they began to see something else in the soldiers. The same British soldiers who had once been seen as mere symbols of foreign intervention were now becoming something more. They were becoming symbols of resistance, of defiance against the occupation. They were not mere men with guns. They were a sign that the war could be fought not just with force, but with ideas, with trust, with collaboration. For Sergeant Thomas, this slow transformation was a mixture of quiet pride and a deep sense of cautious optimism. He had seen what could happen when the people were pushed too far, when their spirit was broken entirely. He had seen how quickly resistance could turn into desperation, how small pockets of defiance could be crushed by the brutal hand of the German occupiers. But what he saw in St. Clair was different. It was not a rebellion in the traditional sense, not yet, but it was something that could grow into something larger. The villagers weren't just taking food, they were taking back their agency. They were, in their own way, participating in a larger struggle. And this, more than anything, was what Sergeant Thomas had hoped to see. The seeds had been planted, and now it was just a matter of whether they would grow into something more. As the weeks went by, the soldiers' interactions with the villagers became more regular. Each time they passed through St. Clair, they would exchange small gifts, rations, words of encouragement, sometimes even simple maps or information about what was happening on the broader front lines of the war. The villagers, in turn, began to return these gestures. They offered what they could: homemade goods, a small bit of tobacco, sometimes a local delicacy. It was a strange barter, one that didn't follow the conventional rules of the marketplace. It wasn't about trade or profit, it was about a shared understanding. A mutual, unspoken agreement that they were not alone in this war, that there was something they could do, even if it was just a small, quiet act of rebellion. The soldiers, now familiar with the rhythm of the town, began to take more risks. They ventured deeper into the village, speaking to more villagers, exchanging more information. The fear that had once characterized every interaction began to melt away, replaced by a growing sense of shared purpose. Still, the reality of their situation was never far from anyone's mind. The Germans continued to patrol the streets, their presence a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked around every corner. For the villagers, any act of resistance was still fraught with peril. The consequences of getting caught were too high. The Germans were unforgiving, and those suspected of aiding the enemy were often made examples of. And so, the villagers remained cautious, careful in their actions, careful in what they shared. But there was something different now, something deeper in the air. It was a sense of solidarity that had not existed before. And that, in its own way, was a powerful force. It was the power of quiet resistance, of standing together even in the face of overwhelming odds. Sergeant Thomas, for all his experience in covert operations, could not have predicted how this would unfold. He had expected caution, maybe even fear, but he had not expected this subtle, grassroots defiance to take shape so quickly. It was not what he had imagined when he first arrived in St. Clair. He had thought of resistance in terms of sabotage, gunfire, and military tactics. But what he was witnessing was something far more profound, something that wasn't born of ideology or military strategy, but of sheer survival, of shared humanity. The villagers, in their own way, were showing him that there was more to resistance than just fighting the enemy. Resistance was about maintaining your dignity in the face of oppression. It was about remembering who you were, even when everything around you tried to erase it. It was about standing firm, not with weapons in hand, but with the quiet strength of knowing that you could still choose to act with kindness, with compassion, and with hope. What began as a simple act of generosity, the sharing of food, had sparked something deep within the village. It had ignited a slow-burning flame of resistance, a flame that was no longer dependent on grand gestures or heroic acts. It was a resistance built on quiet trust, on shared moments of humanity. It was not an open revolt, but it was resistance nonetheless. And for the villagers of St. Clair, it was the first step toward reclaiming something they had lost long ago, their sense of agency, their ability to choose their own path in a world that had sought to strip them of it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make them believe that change was possible, that, even in the darkest of times, there was still hope. The days in St. Clair slowly stretched into weeks, and the subtle, almost imperceptible changes that had begun with the exchange of food between the villagers and Sergeant Thomas gradually began to deepen. The villagers were still fearful, still hesitant, but the small acts of kindness they had received, simple gestures like the sharing of rations, the quiet nods of solidarity from the soldiers, and the slow accumulation of whispered information, began to form the bedrock of something more profound. What had begun as a moment of quiet relief, a brief respite from the crushing weight of occupation, was now subtly shifting into something more significant. It was not an overt revolution or a grand call to arms. It was a slow, deliberate realization. The villagers had started to understand something they had not fully grasped before, that their survival was not solely a matter of enduring, but of resisting. As the villagers began to see the British soldiers as potential allies, the nature of their interactions evolved. The initial wariness and suspicion had not entirely disappeared, but it was tempered now with something different. A tentative trust had been built, and with that trust came a quiet confidence. No longer did the villagers feel entirely alone in their struggle. The soldiers had not come to impose themselves or to take what little they had left. They had come to help, to offer something that had seemed impossible, the possibility of change. The villagers began to realize that the British, far from being distant figures of a foreign power, were representatives of something much more profound. They were symbols of a future beyond occupation, beyond the endless cycles of hunger and fear. But despite this growing bond, the reality of their situation was never far from anyone's mind. The Germans, relentless in their occupation, continued to patrol the streets, their soldiers maintaining a constant presence. The fear of retribution still loomed over everything. Any act of defiance, no matter how small, could be seen as a betrayal, and the consequences of that betrayal were severe. The villagers knew the risks intimately. They had seen firsthand what happened to those who were suspected of collaborating with the enemy. The occupying forces had made examples of people who had resisted, who had dared to offer even the smallest glimmer of opposition. The price for such actions was steep: torture, imprisonment, and execution. This was the grim reality of occupation, and it made every decision, every word spoken, every gesture of kindness fraught with danger. The villagers had learned long ago to keep their heads down, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Survival depended on blending in, on doing what was necessary to avoid the scrutiny of the German soldiers. But now, with the arrival of the British soldiers, things were changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the villagers were beginning to shift from passive endurance to active resistance. It wasn't that they were suddenly ready to rise up in open rebellion. They knew the odds were still stacked against them, that their situation was fragile and precarious. But something had shifted deep within them, a shift that was more psychological than tactical. The arrival of the soldiers had sparked something within the villagers, an ember of hope that had long been smothered under years of oppression. The first signs of this shift were subtle. More villagers began to approach the British soldiers, not with fear or suspicion, but with questions. Questions about the war, about the movements of the German forces, about what was happening outside their village. They didn't necessarily know what to do with this information, but they felt compelled to share it, compelled to take some small action. This was the first stirrings of rebellion, not in the form of weapons or explosions, but in the form of information, the sharing of knowledge that could be used to weaken the occupying forces. Each piece of information, no matter how small, became a small victory. It was a victory of agency, of reclaiming the power to shape their own fates, however incrementally. The soldiers, for their part, knew exactly what was happening, but they too understood the delicate balance they were walking. They did not want to provoke the Germans, nor did they want to force the villagers into action before they were ready. They knew that any overt action, any open sign of resistance, could lead to devastating reprisals. Instead, they chose to tread carefully, to encourage the villagers' subtle acts of defiance without pushing them too far. They offered nothing more than small bits of encouragement, a word here, a map there, a piece of intelligence about the broader movements of the Allied forces. The British soldiers knew that the real battle for St. Clair was not going to be won on the streets, but in the hearts and minds of the people who lived there. As the villagers continued to share more and more information with the soldiers, something else began to happen. They began to see the soldiers not just as bearers of food and supplies, but as symbols of a broader struggle. They were no longer faceless, distant figures who had come to invade. They were part of something larger, part of a global fight against tyranny. The villagers had spent years under the crushing weight of occupation, their lives marked by the brutality of the German soldiers who trampled over their homes, their dignity, and their spirits. The British soldiers, though few in number and operating in secret, represented something new, something they had long lost sight of. They represented the possibility of an end to their suffering, the possibility that, even in the most remote corners of Europe, the war could be turned in their favor. But this realization came with its own set of complications. The villagers were not naive. They understood that any open act of resistance could lead to catastrophic consequences. The Germans had made it clear that they would tolerate no dissent, no matter how small. The reprisals could be swift and brutal. The town had already seen its share of suffering, and the fear of being caught in any act of rebellion was ever present. But the more they spoke with the British soldiers, the more they realized that their survival depended not just on endurance, but on standing together. The soldiers may not have had the power to liberate them immediately, but they represented something vital: the idea that the war was still winnable, that the Germans could be defeated, and that the villagers could have a role in that victory. It was an idea that had been extinguished from their minds for so long, but now it was starting to return. The villagers began to take small steps, tentative steps, toward resistance. These steps were not grand gestures of defiance, but rather quiet acts of rebellion. They began to sabotage the German supply lines, taking small, calculated risks to disrupt the enemy's control over the village. A broken piece of equipment here, a misplaced supply shipment there, each act was small, but it was an act of rebellion nonetheless. It was not the kind of resistance that would immediately change the course of the war, But it was enough to send a message, both to the Germans and to themselves. They had started to reclaim their dignity, and in doing so, they had begun to reclaim their agency. Each small act of sabotage, each bit of intelligence passed to the British soldiers, became a small but vital contribution to the larger struggle. But the village was not without its risks. The German soldiers, though not always visible, were always present, their eyes always watching. The villagers knew that one misstep, one slip of the tongue, could lead to disaster. The Germans were watching more closely now. They had begun to notice the small changes in the village. People speaking more openly, more villagers gathered together in small groups, more information passing between them. The German soldiers had grown suspicious, and that suspicion was dangerous. The villagers had no illusions about the consequences if they were caught.